And we continue now with Dr. Robert A. Heineman, political science professor emeritus. Dr. Bob, thank you for joining us.
Well, good morning to you, Brian.
Well, Dr. Bob, what did you think of the president's speech last night?
Well, I thought it was really pretty fascinating. I think to put a little context for our audience, we might just note the constitutional balance there between the national government and the states. Our Constitution makes a distinction between the national government and the states. A lot of people think of governments as national, state, and local, but really we're talking about national and state governments. The local governments are basically creatures of the states, something that Mayor de Blasio has never quite picked up on yet, but nonetheless. But the interesting point about the federal system as it's set up in the Constitution is that the government that is limited is the national government. And the national government cannot act unless it can find some basis in the Constitution for being able to act. And I know that's counterintuitive to people because obviously the national government today is really quite strong. And there are a couple of reasons for that, one of which is that the Supreme Court has been very generous in interpreting the powers that are spelled out in the Constitution for the national government. And number two, the national government raises a huge amount of money, and so they have tremendous financial resources at their disposal. With that in line, then, the national government can be, pretty powerful in this day and age. On the other hand, the states are not really limited, except perhaps by their constitutions, by the national constitution. They have what are called state police powers, which means they have the power to act for the health, welfare, morals, safety, et cetera, of their citizens. And so what you saw in President Trump's presentation with his aides yesterday was a really pretty sophisticated knowledge, I think, of how the federal system should be working. And I think in that sense, the president is kind of a quick study in this. I'm not certain he was up on all this till the recent pandemic. But what you have, I think, there is a situation in which the Trump administration is telling the governors, we'll do everything we can to help you. And here's kind of the phases we should be going through, and that'll differ from state to state, but we'll be providing a tremendous amount of monitoring and early detection and working with the governors in that respect. And if you think of it in terms of the governors, it's really to the governor's benefit to do everything they can, of course, to hold this virus down as well. So it should be a win-win situation for the national government to help out and for the governors to get in there and do everything they can to maximize the resources available to them and to use their police powers to regulate how their citizens behave. So all in all, I think the potential here is really pretty promising. And I think giving Fauci and Birch their credit, and plus the others that helped them, of course, they got a pretty good sense of how to go about approaching this. So I think the president has a pretty good sense of how far the national government can go and pretty good sense of how helpful the states can be.
Dr. Bob, I think this whole thing got started because President Trump said that he has total authority when it comes to reopening the economy. He said that earlier this week, the president did. I think what happened was he lost his cool because he took the bait from reporters, got mad, and then took out his anger sort of on the governors in a way, saying that they were in rebellion and mutiny, and they were all. I think he was really mad at the reporters because they're constantly trying to undermine him and get it, and they're constantly looking for a moment like that where he loses his cool.
Well, I think you have a point there in the sense that these press conferences he's holding, frankly, should be a lot shorter, and he should have a topic and some sort of subject, cover it, basically, take one or two questions and move on. He's got better things to do, and you're right, the reporters are just lying there trying to get a gotcha moment of some sort or another, and sometimes they are successful in doing that. Now, that does lead us to another kind of constitutional question, which is, I think, kind of interesting, and that is that in the Constitution, the branch of government that is limited is Congress. Article 1, which deals with Congress, specifically states Congress is, and my Constitution there, is limited to the powers herein granted. So Congress is specifically limited to the powers that are spelled out in Article 1, and they spell out coining money, declaring war, etc., etc. But the Article 2, which deals with the president's power, simply states that the executive power will be exercised by the president. So it doesn't state any limit or anything. It just says the president shall exercise the executive power. So it's clearly worded differently. And I'm sure the authors of the Constitution intended for that difference to be there. So that leads to the whole question, and which has been a constant question for constitutional scholars and theorists since the founding, and that is, does the president have what is called prerogative power? Does the president have innate powers to act on his own without any direct authorization from Congress or the Constitution? And over the years, with mixed results, the Supreme Court has held that the president does have innate power or inherent power to act on his own. Now, he cannot act contrary to the Constitution. He cannot act contrary to a clear statement by Congress. Congress has a particular law in place. The president can't just wander off and do what he wants to do. But without a specific law or without a specific constitutional provision, there is quite a bit of leeway in there for a president to take action, especially in an emergency or when quick action is needed. And I think that's why the Founding Fathers left that sort of gap there. Now, I think your point on Trump is that he probably was overstating how much power he thought he had.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, the presidents do have certain inherent powers there, I think. Yeah.
I think if you look at it objectively,
yes.
If anybody was talked to the way Trump is by CNN and MSNBC, if anybody was talked to in that way, they would lose their cool too and probably say something they didn't mean. Usually the stakes aren't as high, but...
Right. No, I think he overstated. Even the National Review got a little worked up about it. Now, he does have tremendous power. And if you make him angry, as the director of WHO, the World Health Organization, is discovering, he can bring a considerable amount of power to bear. In the case of the World Health Organization, we're cutting way back on funding, which I think we have every right to do. But again, in terms of dealing with states or corporations or something of that sort, he does have a lot of tools he can bring into play, but he surely does not have absolute power of any kind. And the national government, the Constitution was written to prevent anybody from getting into that sort of situation. So you look at a situation like China with Xi Jinping, who, in some ways exercises almost absolute power. I don't think he has absolute power. I guess a better example there would be the yo-yo that runs North Korea. But nonetheless, he's has considerable power. The President of the United States is not anywhere near able to do anything like what Xi Jinping can do. So that in terms of being able to act, the President has to act as a leader and as an encourager and things of that sort, which I think Mr. Trump is moving more and more to that kind of position. It's not like he's running one of his hotels or one of his golf courses. And
right.
Kind of thing. He has to work with other people. And that's the way it was intended to be. And so you get some of these commentators talking about how inefficient this was done or how inefficient that was done. The federal government was not set up to be efficient. It was set up to protect us from the government. And it's done a reasonable good job of that. So that the idea of efficiency at the national level shows up rarely. Although I must say, the presentation yesterday does indicate that the federal government and the states, they can operate pretty well when they all have the same goal in mind.
Dr. Heineman, Trump's critics say that Trump is a bit of a dictator because Trump refuses to hand over documents related to the Russia impeachment inquiry. And how would you answer that criticism that's made against President Trump on that issue?
One of the main points there is these documents that I'm thinking of, a lot of them have nothing to do with the impeachment inquiry, and Congress really doesn't have much of a base to be insisting on those documents. First and foremost, after the 2 years and $25 million that Mr. Mueller spent trying to discover whether Trump did anything wrong, he was unable to come up with any criminal activity whatsoever with regard to Trump. And it seems to me once you start wanting to subpoena documents and evidence, you got to have some sort of criminal charge here somewhere that enables you to do that. You can't just kind of throw out a fishing net there and hope somewhere along the line you can find something that might have some criminal aspects. Also, it's pretty clear on some of these things, like his income tax and some of these other areas, all they really want to do is try to embarrass him as much as they can. And so what I say to that is that I'm not certain. Trump is certainly holding his ground, and he's holding his ground for presidents who follow him. It would set a really bad precedent, I think, if he starts turning over personal and business papers to Congress. But on the other hand, the Supreme Court is going to hear some of those issues within the next few weeks. So the courts are in a position to step in and tell the president he can't do this or he can do that. So there are a number of protections in place there, that's for sure.
Someday, Dr. Bob, we should do a show on just Trump executive orders and review them and go over them, because that's how a lot of presidents seem to draw the wrath of the opposition party and the critics. Right. And right. The critics will always say, well, W or Obama went too far in their executive orders, and executive orders were not meant to do that. What were executive orders intended to do?
Well, basically, they're intended to help implement legislation and to fill in some of the gaps where Congress cannot pass detailed statutes. And on top of which, Congress very often does not want to pass detailed statutes, primarily because they can't get a majority to get the law passed, so that you get Congress passing statutes with pretty ambiguous language. Like there's one statute out there somewhere that says that the Education Department, the act should bring educational standards up to the national average. Well, I don't know how you have an average if you keep bringing standards up. I mean, there's pretty strange language in some of these statutes, which tends to be pretty ambiguous, and it then requires an agency to step in and start trying to come up with regulations of some sort or another, or the president can step in and issue executive orders or one thing or another to move things one way or another. Well, the president is, I guess, constitutionally not a legislator. The Constitution says he will take care to see the laws are faithfully executed. Still, somebody has to fill in there, and that's kind of what he's doing. And there's been some real abuses of executive orders. There's no question about that at all. Obama passed a lot of them in his last few weeks as president, and I think Bush did too, actually. So the incoming president has, 30 days or something like that to repeal them, and that's, I think, what Trump did. And I think so. So it's kind of a game back and forth in that sense. But it's an important part of government, the size we have. You've got to have somebody who can step in and move things one way or another.
Dr. Bob, it's a little off the beaten track here on the topic we were on, but I wanted to bring up, since I brought up W and Obama before.
Yes.
It seems to me that everybody, since at least Reagan in my lifetime, everybody since, before that, it was Chevy Chase falling down the stairs pretending to be Jerry Ford on Saturday Night Live. Every Republican since at least the post-Nixon era has been portrayed as really, really, really dumb in the media. They did that to Reagan. They did that to a certain degree to H.W. Bush. They definitely did it to W. Now they're doing it to Trump. But Trump was a media darling before all this. When W was in office, they were talking about what a crummy moron W was, and he must have cheated his way through.
What you're dealing with there, and I've thought of this off and on myself, what you're dealing with is a cadre of sort of pseudo-intellectuals that come out of the Ivy League background and some of these other schools in the East that have, over the years, set themselves up as kind of the guiding lights of the American system. And in many ways, many times they were really quite good. But when you get somebody like Reagan, or as you say, H.W. Bush,
or W, yeah.
But on the other hand, you look at some of these Democrat presidents. You never heard them make fun of Kennedy, and there's plenty there that you could certainly criticize and make fun of, or Clinton. Nobody ever called Clinton dumb. On the other hand, nobody ever called Nixon dumb either.
Why was that?
Because he's pretty smart, that's why.
So they couldn't get away with that one.
No, he was just too bright, too obviously bright for the press and for these intellectual types out of the East Coast here.
They did make fun of his uptightness, though. They like to portray him as paranoid.
Yeah, well, I think he was. No question about that.
But I find it interesting that the people who say these kind of things contradict themselves constantly, and it never occurs to them. I suppose that's because they're relativists, a lot of them, and relativists have this constantly changing sense of truth and history. Whatever they want to be true is true when they want it to be true. Am I right?
Well, you may overstate it a little bit there, but yeah, I think, again, it comes from a kind of enclosed group that is pretty convinced about how much more intelligent they are than the rest of us. And you know what is really quite humorous about it, is that they aren't any smarter, if as smart, as a lot of the people in the rest. The people in the rest of the country.
If I could continue to philosophize just briefly here, and this is somebody else's observation, Kevin Dorn, longtime host of the Newsmaker show, used to call the media the fourth branch of government. Obviously, the three other branches being executive, legislative, and judicial. And if I could add to that whole thing of the fourth branch of government, there is a snobbishness in some of these reporters. You can hear it on the Reid calls.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
They talk down to Reid. I would never do that to Schumer. I would never do that to Gillibrand. But there's something in some of these reporters.
Well, and it is, as you say, it kind of feeds on itself. Now, I was listening to Perino. What is it? Deanna Perino, or what is her?
Dana Perino.
Yeah, she's very bright.
Mm-hmm.
And the other day, she was commenting on Biden's appearance on one of the MSNBC or something, where he went on and on about how Trump was blaming everybody else, et cetera, et cetera. And her point was, here's Biden following the group that he works with and talks to, and they all think how stupid Trump is and how dangerous Trump is, et cetera, et cetera. And so he spent his time attacking Trump when Perino points out, there's some other pretty serious problems out there in the country. You might be a lot better off getting off that issue and moving on to some things people are really concerned about. And I think that's a very good point she made.
I have a friend.
Go ahead.
I have a friend who says he won't vote until he can start voting for the heads of agencies and offices in Washington. And he says, too much focus on the executive branch, too much focus on the legislative branch. He says, until I can vote for the heads of this, that, and the other agency, I'm not going to vote.
Yeah, well, that man's in a different world.
but there's a certain point there.
He isn't voting.
But there's a certain point there in I think what he's saying is the executive branch doesn't hold all the power. It's not a one-man show.
No, it certainly is not. It certainly is not. And even if you get in a situation where you have, let's say, a conservative Republican president, and then you've got all these Democrat-oriented agency heads, even though the president has the power in many of these instances to fire them or change them, they can still cause a lot of problems. So the point is, again, the president has to step forward as a leader, somebody who can get some enthusiasm behind what he wants to do and get everybody on the same page. Now, I knew a number of these people who worked with Reagan, and Reagan was very careful in terms of the people who he appointed to these positions, so that they basically agreed with his basic approach toward government and the need for less government. And you can compare that to Nixon, when the people he appointed were people who were loyal to Nixon. And that's what he wanted, as people who were basically his people. Reagan was much broader in the sense he wanted people who showed a general conservative orientation. So he had two differences there, and I guess it worked out all right in both cases, although Nixon did have some problems.
With that, we do have to go, Dr. Bob. Always great having you on. Have a nice weekend.
Yes, you too, Brian. Thank you much.
Talk to you next week.
Okay.